We want America to lead. We want our enemies to fear us, and we want our allies to trust us. So what does it say when the United States repeatedly bends over backwards to accommodate the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism? By bend over backwards, I don't just mean all of these concessions, cash infusions, and side deals. I don't just mean sending the Secretary of State out to shill for Iran like he's the president of the Tehran Chamber of Commerce. I don't just mean paying ransom for hostages. We now know that the administration misled the public about the details of the arrangement with this Iranian regime. First, there was a payment, but it had nothing to do with the hostages. Then, it did have to do with the hostages, but it wasn't a ransom. Then, the president said we couldn't wire the money, but we all now know that they could have wired the money. The administration is not just circumventing the parameters of this agreement. It is pushing legal and ethical boundaries to appease this regime. Now, Chairman Royce is right. We cannot let this happen again. We need to stop these cash payments. We also cannot afford to let our foreign policy keep drifting like this. This is why, as part of our Better Way agenda, we are offering a real national security message, a real national security agenda and vision for the country. 67 points, 67 ideas, 67 takeaways for how you get America's security back on track. You can learn more about this by going to better.gop. It's a shame that we even have to pass this legislation in the first place, but I want to thank Chairman Ed Royce for doing that.
New Jersey, Minnesota, New York, all this past weekend. One thing that we learned, we want to thank those that are a part of the police force, those that were the first responders. But the one thing you will find when you talk to them about the situation, they'll say we got lucky. Got lucky that it could have been so much worse. That where America is today. I want to thank Chairman Royce for his work. I also want to thank Chairman McCall releasing the counterterrorism strategy yesterday from the House Homeland Security Committee. This wasn't something that was scheduled based upon what happened last weekend. This was scheduled prior. Just as we've been, from the very beginning of this Congress, working on protecting the homeland. You know, we put a task force together, one being led by Chairman Royce and others, and we passed more than 10 bills. 3 of them dealing with radicalizing those here on the homeland. One of the biggest threats and fears that I have for our future. Those bills are stuck over in the Senate. We want to make sure they get moved and onto the President. But what we'll see this week on the floor, what Chairman Royce talks about, is something that you have to really think. What the President did when he paid ransom for hostages changed the principle of what American policy had for centuries. What the President did when he paid them in cash with no transparency to the American public, and when he stood before the American public and said he had to pay in cash because they're so strong on the sanctions that you could not wire money. Why is that important? If you wire money, you can follow where it goes. Less flexibility for Iran. If you pay them in cash, you have no idea where it goes. It's what Iran asked for. Iran sponsors terrorism around the world. Are we safer because of this payment? But when the President said this, we took him at his word. But now we found out, in the last 14 months, his own administration, not once, but twice, has wired money to Iran. So either it's not true that you can't wire it, or he didn't know it. I think the American public have a right to know which part is the truth. That's why today, this week on the floor, Chairman Royce's bill will talk about whether this money's for ransom or not, going against the policy and a principle of America, and also stop any cash payments in the future and greater transparency. I don't think there should be one person on the floor to vote against that bill, because I don't understand why someone would be opposed to it.
This weekend, we continued to see more terrorism coming to America's soil. In this case, more homegrown terrorism, which is an increasing problem. The House has taken action over the last few months to address homegrown terrorism. The Senate needs to take action on that. The President needs to step up his actions. But one thing we're going to do this week, and I want to thank Chairman Royce and his committee for their leadership on confronting this ransom payment that the President made to Iran. When the initial word came out that $400 million was sent in unmarked bills on an unmarked plane to, in essence, exchange that money for American hostages, it sent a chilling signal. But what we heard from the White House was denials, actually calling us out, saying it wasn't about ransom payments. And then, of course, we found out that the President misled the American people and continues to refuse to confront this problem and how it actually makes America less safe. And we've seen that play out. We've seen more Americans and other Westerners taken hostage. When you put a price tag on the head of Americans, all it's going to do is encourage Iran to continue this behavior of capturing our men and women and then holding them out for cash payments from this president. Where's that money ending up? I think a very important question that ought to be asked to President Obama is how much of that $1.7 billion in unmarked cash bills are going to go to Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations. We already know that Iran's the largest state sponsor of terrorism. So the question is not if, but how much of that money is going to end up in the hands of terrorist organizations who go after our allies like Israel and Americans. So these are serious questions. At least the House is continuing to confront this and take more action to prevent it from happening again. But what's already happened deserves serious answers from the White House, and this time candor, no longer misleading the American people like they have in the past.
The United States does not negotiate with terrorists. It's not just a mantra. These 8 words have saved countless American lives. It's a promise to the American people that their safety and security is our top priority. But this administration threw that out the window by showcasing on national stage that the president will negotiate if that's what it's going to take to keep a campaign promise. The violence that we have seen in New York, St. Cloud, Minnesota, and other places is yet another somber reminder of the very real threats that face our country. And some of the worst have been created by Iran. That's why I am just baffled by the insistence that we meet Iran's demands. This is a country that continues to be a destructive force in the Middle East, financing the very people that attack our subways and our shopping malls. This administration has failed to hold them accountable for their support of terrorism and now for holding Americans hostage. By paying a ransom, President Obama not only rewarded bad actors for their bad behavior, he made Americans more vulnerable when they travel abroad by setting a precedent in effort to save face. I'm grateful that we have Chairman Royce with us today and David Trott and other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee for their commitment to getting the facts. This is all part of the House Republicans' efforts to offer a better way, to ensure that we are safe and secure as Americans. We stand resolved. We are renewing our commitment to protect you and defend America's interests at home and abroad.
Thank you, Jeffrey. For the last 7 years, President Obama has insisted on pursuing many policies that the American people don't want. One of these includes the repeated attempts to close the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. There's been strong bipartisan majorities in Congress that have consistently voted to prohibit closing the prison, and Americans all across the country have raised their voices in opposition. Unfortunately, the president continues to ignore the law and ignores the facts showing Gitmo is the safest place for these terrorists. President Obama has even continued to transfer terrorists abroad, despite his own State Department admitting last week that 2 more prisoners had returned to the battlefield. That brings the total count to more than 120 former Gitmo detainees that have re-engaged in terrorism. We can't allow this reckless behavior to continue. That's why last week the House voted once again to prohibit the transfer of any individual detained at Gitmo until January of 2017. Too often, national security is just something thrown around as a catchphrase, and its significance is ignored. Yet at a time when America is facing growing threats at home and abroad, we can't afford for that to be the case. Legislation like the bill passed last week and the Iran sanctions bill to be voted on today recognize that there is a better way to protect American lives, and we are going to continue to fight for that.
Questions?
What remains unsettled in the continuing resolution? Can you assure conservatives in your caucus that their priorities will be in the legislation?
Yeah, look, we're getting close. It's not there yet. Our House appropriators are working with our counterparts. I think this will get done this week. When the vote occurs, we'll have to see because we have a 3-day rule. And I'll just say on Planned Parenthood, there was never an earmark for Planned Parenthood. There's not going to be an earmark for Planned Parenthood. And let me just rest assured, there will be no public funding of abortions. Chad.
Mr. Speaker, that said, though, it appears that there's been resolution on the Zika part which pertains to Planned Parenthood, and we understand the distinguishing part of the language of the bill that was passed in June. But that said, do you feel that there is going to be a firestorm among members of your conference who are pro-life and pro-life groups because of the
I do not. First of all, this bill is not done yet, so I'm not going to comment on legislation that's still being drafted. It's not done yet. But I think, again, there's not going to be an earmark for Planned Parenthood.
Well, and so,
Yeah.
but not an earmark, sir.
But I'm not going to comment on a bill that's not finished yet. Yeah.
Saudi Arabia is opposed to the JASTA legislation that the president is expected to veto and Congress to override. Some lawmakers have been saying this is a signal that U.S. support for Saudi Arabia is not unconditional. Do you agree with that? What message is this sending?
Well, our support for any country is not unconditional. I mean, that's just goes without saying for any nation. But let me just say, Saudi Arabia is a very important and valuable ally to the United States, to our interests. They're helping us in many ways in the war on terror, and they're helping us with Iranian proxies. So they're a valuable ally. We see them as a valuable ally, and this legislation is going to work its way through the process, and I think you all know the outcome. Andy.
Do you support flood aid to Louisiana as requested by the delegation and the president? Do you support maybe doing some of that now?
I do.
And then also, do you believe it should be held to the same standard on offsets that you're establishing for Zika?
Well, first of all, Zika is not all offset. Our bill didn't 100% offset Zika. Steve can explain what's going on in Louisiana and how this is a disaster as well. We do support flood aid to the victims in Louisiana. Yeah, Susan.
How would you vote on the JASTA veto override if it gets?
Well, I don't vote, but if I would, I do have concerns about the legislation, but I'm going to let Congress work its will because that's what Congress does. I do think the votes are there for the override. I can't speak to the Senate. I just don't know the answer to that, but I'm pretty certain it would. If it passed unanimously in the Senate in the first place. It passed by voice vote in the House. I think that just shows you where this is going. I do have concerns about it because I worry about legal matters. I worry about trial lawyers trying to get rich off of this, and I do worry about the precedents. At the same time, these victims need to have their day in court. Yeah.
Do you plan to bring up the JASTA override before you guys leave this month?
It depends on the Senate timing. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that question. It depends on how long it takes for us to get our other work done. I heard that the Senate Majority Leader said they're going to stay. So if we're in and they pass it, then it's going to come over here and we'll pass it.